Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a deep dive into one of the most astonishing geopolitical turnarounds of the 20th century. We're looking at two nations that went from literally dropping bombs on each other to sharing top-secret defense intelligence and building massive, interconnected economies. Seriously, how did the US and Japan go from being locked in a completely devastating global conflict to becoming the absolute closest of allies? Well, it's a fascinating story of shifting global power, intense strategic calculations, and multi-layered reconciliation. And to really understand it, we need to start by correcting a pretty common historical misconception.
It's really easy to think this entire story just suddenly begins with a flash of atomic light. But it doesn't. Not at all. The chain of events started much, much earlier. It actually began with Japanese expansion in Asia, rising US pushback, intense economic pressure, and a total collapse of diplomacy, which all ultimately culminated in the breaking point at Pearl Harbor.
To truly grasp the gravity of 1945, we have to travel back a bit. Section 1. The Road to War.
Tensions between these two powers didn't just snap overnight. They had been boiling over for years. By 1937, Japan was expanding aggressively into China. The US responded by really squeezing Japan economically, essentially cutting off the vital resources they needed to fuel their war machine. Trapped between the prospect of losing their empire or striking first, Japan chose the latter. On December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor transformed a tense diplomatic standoff into an absolute global inferno.
And from that breaking point, we enter a grueling four-year conflict. Section 2. The Pacific War's Turning Tide.
While Japan's initial victories were definitely massive, they very quickly ran into an overwhelming reality. The sheer industrial muscle of the US kicked in, churning out ships and planes at a completely unstoppable rate. When you combine that juggernaut of production with relentless submarine warfare and total economic blockades, Japan's early successes were just systematically dismantled. By 1945, Japan was facing incredibly severe military and economic pressure, devastating conventional bombing across its cities, and the very real, looming prospect of a mainland invasion.
Which brings us to a grave and pivotal moment in human history. Section 3. August 1945, the surrender.
In July of 1945, the top-secret Manhattan Project succeeded. The U.S. now held a terrifying new weapon, and the rationale for actually using it was incredibly complex. Now, while the primary goal was to force a rapid surrender and avoid a catastrophic mainland invasion, it's important to note that historians today still intensely debate this decision. They constantly weigh Japan's failing military position at the time against alternative diplomatic options as well as the impending actions of other global powers.
The sequence of events that August was rapid, and it was devastating. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The city suffered catastrophic destruction and an enormous, tragic loss of human life, demonstrating a terrifying new level of destructive power. But it is an absolutely critical historical fact that Japan did not immediately surrender after this event. Hiroshima alone cannot explain the final decision to end the war.
Because exactly 2 days later, a second massive shockwave hit. The Soviet Union formally declared war on Japan and launched a huge offensive right into Manchuria. Suddenly, Japan's leaders weren't just facing unprecedented destruction from the sky, they were facing a massive, fresh military force invading directly from the north. This was a total strategic nightmare and is absolutely central to the historical debate over why Japan finally surrendered.
And then, the very next day, August 9, 1945, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on the city of Nagasaki. The immense, rapid-fire shock placed on Japan's leadership over these 3 days was just unparalleled.
So as we piece this together, we can see that the surrender wasn't a reaction to just one single event. It was actually the collapse of four pillars all at once. You had the unprecedented shock of the atomic bombs, the disastrous new Soviet front, a military completely starved by blockades, and a deeply fractured domestic leadership. It was really the crushing weight of all four of these simultaneous realities that finally pushed the leadership toward that final surrender decision.
The climax of this timeline hits in mid-August. Japan accepted the Allied surrender terms, and Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender to the Japanese public on August 15th. A few weeks later, on September 2, 1945, the formal instrument of surrender was signed. The fighting had stopped. The most destructive war in human history was finally over. But here is the key takeaway for us. The cessation of hostilities ended the war, sure, but it did not instantly create a friendly relationship.
Let's look at how that actually happened in Section 4, Occupation and Rebuilding Japan.
Literally overnight, the U.S. flipped from enemy combatant to occupying power, and they came in with a very strict to-do list. Step 1. Demilitarize. Completely dismantle Japan's armed forces so they could never pose a threat again. Step 2. Reform. Restructure the political institutions from the ground up to heavily encourage democracy. And Step 3, the absolutely monumental task of rebuilding a shattered economy and society into a peaceful, responsible state.
But while this huge occupation effort was underway, the global map was shifting yet again. Section 5, Cold War and New Allies.
Almost as soon as the ink dried on the surrender, a new shadow fell over the globe, the Cold War. Suddenly, Washington had this major realization. A weak, impoverished Japan wasn't just a former enemy anymore, it was a massive security liability. To counter Soviet expansion in Asia, the U.S. desperately needed Japan to be strong, stable, and prosperous. In a very short amount of time, the geopolitical script had completely flipped.
You can actually see this incredible shift play out in real time through two foundational treaties. In 1951, the San Francisco Peace Treaty simply ended the state of war and returned sovereignty back to Japan. But fast forward just 9 years to 1960, the two nations signed a mutual security treaty locking in a dramatic, long-term military partnership. It remains, to this day, one of the most astonishing diplomatic U-turns in modern history, former bitter wartime enemies cooperating deeply on security and economics.
But reconciliation wasn't just magic, right? It was carefully engineered over decades, through shared Cold War security fears and a booming Japanese economy that genuinely benefited both nations. Bound by heavy trade, strategic security treaties, and eventually a new generation eager to move forward, the intense wartime hostilities slowly, but surely, gave way to deep interdependence.
So, we've seen how geopolitical survival completely transformed the fiercest of enemies into the closest of allies. It really proves that alliances are built on the strategic needs of the present, not just the grudges of the past. As we look at the rapidly shifting global powers and tensions of today, it leaves us with a pretty critical question. How will today's rivalries reshape the alliances of tomorrow? Thanks so much for watching this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.